Good evening. This is Harry Reasoner. For the last few days, this country has lived under indictment, a charge of white racism, national in scale, terrible in its effects. The evidence to support that charge has now been presented. More than 1,400 pages of testimony, findings, conclusions, the full text of a report released just last night. These are the disturbing answers to the questions which the President asked for the nation in the heat and shock of last summer.
The civil peace has been shattered in a number of cities. The American people are deeply disturbed. They are baffled and dismayed by the wholesale looting and violence that has occurred both in small towns and in great metropolitan centers. No society can tolerate massive violence any more than a body can tolerate massive disease. And we in America shall not tolerate it. We need to know the answer, I think, to three basic questions about these riots. What happened? Why did it happen? What can be done to prevent it from happening again and again?
In their answers to those questions, the President's Special Commission on Civil Disorders has confronted the American people with a new shock to our national sense of well-being, a shock and a warning. Our nation, says the report, is moving toward two separate societies, black and white, separate but unequal. If the division is allowed to widen, it says, we will find ourselves living in a state of tension and lawlessness held in check only by repression. In those words, the report summons up an image that is more like the other side of the Iron Curtain or the garrison states of Latin America than our image of the United States. In the riots of last summer, the Commission sees the whole shape of that danger. The violence of last summer, it says, was more white repression than Negro protest. There is only one hope, it says, of keeping disorder from taking over permanently, and that is to reverse the course of racism, which is its basic cause, to rub out the boundaries of the ghetto and relieve the poverty that breeds there. To do this in what the Commission calls a commitment to national action. It amounts to a national alliance of government and private resources, with the federal government taking the initiative on four basic problems: jobs, housing, schools, and welfare. In this broadcast, we will examine these proposals, the findings on which they are based, and the atmosphere in which this country faces the choice between commitment and disorder.
What we had to do was tell it like it is. We've been terribly alarmed and depressed by studying this problem for the last 7 months. And what we've tried to do in this report is to let people see this thing through our eyes and to feel it in the pit of their stomachs like we do. And then if they see what a crisis this really is, what a terribly serious crisis this is for our country, I think there'll be a great deal more willingness to try to move to do something about it.
This society believes that it can have its affluence and its injustice at the same time. And it will continue to believe this until it becomes excruciatingly clear that it's impossible. It will not, if we're going to judge from the past, it will not plan to eradicate slums. It will not allocate the resources to get rid of our ghettos. And to me, only this will prevent riots and instability for the future.
This is a CBS News special report on the findings and recommendations of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. Harry Reasoner reporting.
In downtown Atlanta, there is a street corner where men come before dawn to pick up a day's work and a day's pay, where you can see and hear about the indignity of being black in rich white America.
I have to pay more for my food, more for my car fare, more for rent, more for everything. Every time I come to town, you overcharge me for everything I get. And I better not even cross a light. You're going to double charge me for that. And how in the world do you expect for me to get it? Then if I go out here and steal something, Reedsville. But now that's where people make criminals out of people. You're not going to give them nothing, just enough to keep you eating. Yeah, I eat breakfast this morning. I don't know where dinner coming from. How do you think I feel? How do I feel? And then you take all this money and go there, feed the Japanese, Senegalese, and everybody else, and here me been here all my life long and can't make it.
This man's anguish is the real substance of the Riot Commission's report. His distress multiplied by the 15 million Negroes who live in American cities. The most prevalent symptom is poverty, but the real trouble, the thing that holds them down, is color. In the Commission's phrase, the racial attitudes and behavior of white Americans toward black Americans. The people who did the actual rioting are described about like this in the report. Most were young, more than half of them between 15 and 24. Most were school dropouts, but better educated than the average ghetto dweller. 4 out of 5 were employed, some of them making as much as $150 a week, but most of them holding down menial jobs. There's another way to describe them, by the list of their grievances compiled by the Commission. It's a kind of composite self-portrait, the picture of a man who sees himself as an outsider in our society, shoved along from callous schools toward a dead-end job, confined to blighted neighborhoods, exploited by white merchants, ignored by local government, harassed and abused by its agents, the police. In 12 out of 24 riots studied by the Commission, the spark that touched off disorder was an incident involving the police. How incident grew into disaster can be seen in a composite picture of the riots, which we have assembled according to the findings of the report. The sparks fell in the tinder of crowded streets, in neighborhoods peevish with the discomfort of summer in the ghetto. Friction with the police was not the cause, but only the last in a chain of causes, the years of ghetto distress and frustration. The first serious acts of lawlessness, looting. Most of the Negro violence consisted of just that, looting by small groups of people. That and the setting of fires. The police, undermanned at the scene, were slow to react, slow to send in reinforcements. When help came, it was too late and too much. Police reinforcements, the National Guard, both overreacted, responding with a violence out of proportion to the threat, responding in many cases with the only weapons they had, deadly weapons. The gunfire, the report says, was almost entirely from the side of the police and National Guard, much of it wild and panicky. There was some sniping, the report says, but relatively little. In the heat of disorder, the law acted indiscriminately. Mass arrests that swept up many innocent bystanders along with the lawbreakers. In the conflict between white authority and black ghetto, old grievances deepened and spread. In most cases, it was only in the later stages, after panic had been turned loose, that crowds were caught up in the riot psychosis and joined in the looting and burning. The targets were almost entirely ghetto stores owned by whites, but the fires spread out of control. What happened was disaster beyond purpose, beyond any plan. 83 dead, most of them Negro civilians. The loss in dollars was much less than estimated at the time. The damage to the nation's spirit is not to be measured, only to be salvaged if we can. Why did it happen? The report analyzes it in this way. Rising Negro pride, emerging in the civil rights movement, continual frustration and disappointment, tension so high that it was ready to snap at almost any incident. What turned incident into disorder? The violent response of our own institutions, the excesses mainly of the police and the National Guard. But the Commission also blames local governments for being out of touch with their Negro minorities, for failing to respond to the signals of ghetto grievances. It also criticizes the news media, the newspapers, radio and television for the same thing. Also for making the riots seem more like civil war than they really were, partly by overplaying Negro violence, partly by carrying hasty reports from city officials on the amount of damage. I remember getting and using on my own broadcasts a figure of $500 million damage from Detroit, a figure that has since proved 10 times too high. The commission is critical, finally, of Negro militants who heated up the atmosphere of the ghettos, made them more receptive to lawlessness, and exploited the disorder once it began. But the report concludes there is no evidence that any riot was planned or instigated by any Negro organization, or that riots in any city were caused by outsiders. In explaining the origins of the riots, the report calls attention to the historic tradition of lawlessness in this country, the vigilante violence that dates from frontier days and that has often been used against the Negroes themselves, from lynchings to the race wars of the early 1940s. And the threat of violence, the Commission warns, is contained in the country's very preparations for maintaining law and order in the summers to come. In the matter of riot control, of keeping any future incident from spreading into riot, the Commission warns against repeating one of last summer's gravest errors, the error of excessive force. This is a staged riot, a National Guard unit running through its standard riot drill while the cities were in turmoil last summer. The drill, says the Commission, is unrealistic, the tactics destructive. In last year's real tragedy, the adversary was more often a hit-and-run group than a menacing mob. The bayonet served only to inflame violence instead of suppressing it. Civil disorder is not warfare, says the report. It should not be treated as such. What the Riot Commission favors is tactics like these, new measures aimed at singling out the actual lawbreakers instead of punishing a whole neighborhood. It recommends armored vehicles for defense, not for firepower, to protect the guardsmen as they advance to root out snipers or fugitives. The emphasis here is on safety, not just for the guardsmen, but for people in nearby houses to hold down casualties and keep panic from spreading. There are new regulations warning the men to avoid the kind of random fire that raised such havoc last summer.
I want to remind you again also that although all of you have the ammunition, the only person that's been picked to fire is the sharpshooter, and he's to fire only at the targets as indicated by the platoon leader. And the rest of you are not to fire until you've been given the specific order. You can imagine what will happen out here if you had to fire in an area like this, and everybody starts shooting indiscriminately with all the civilians that are running around.
Officially, this Ohio National Guard unit trains according to principles urged by the Riot Commission, firmness and restraint. Unofficially, CBS News has found there is a note of impatience in the outlook for next summer. The Ohio National Guard commander, Major General Erwin Hostetler.
Actually, it's up to the police to handle the situation. We back the police up. We don't make any arrests or anything like that. But I think that everyone in the state of Ohio, and I know I'm getting awful tired of spending 24 hours a day during the summertime with my uniform in the back of the car ready to go anywhere in the state, and my officers are too, and also my men. And the police departments are also getting tired of it, and I think that everybody's just getting a little hard-nosed about the situation. And I assure you that some of these rabble-rousers, they think they're going to have a field day. They might get fooled.
The police, like the National Guard, are involved in a conflict between policies and passions. The police, who, the report emphasizes, are the legal authority and the first line of defense in our cities. Like the National Guard, they too are rearming. By the Commission standards, they may be overarming. Some local police forces are ordering vehicles of this type at $12,000 each. The armor itself is useful, but machine guns, the report insists, are weapons of war, not civil order. Except as a last resort, the police arsenal should be limited to devices like tear gas explosives and water hoses. One riot control weapon, recommended but still controversial, is chemical mace.
This may well become one of the most important parts of your arsenal because this causes fumes, tear gas type fumes, which can cover quite an area. In fact, let me warn you, if you've just squirted one or two people with this thing, be careful about putting them in the squad car, or you may have to drive with your head out the window. Lieutenant Ducharme is going to give you an actual demonstration of the effects of this chemical mace. And then you will be able to use it. You've been issued it, and we expect that you will use it with discretion, use it wisely, but use it effectively.
All right, fella.
Well, when I first got hit, my face started burning quite a bit, and then my first reaction was to grab my face and try and clear my eyes, because it was in my eyes, and then some got in my mouth, and I tried spitting it out. And just can't explain it. It burns your face, it burns your eyes. You can't do anything, really.
Some Negro groups insist that, far from harmless, mace may cause permanent damage. A different sort of doubt surrounds the use of other weapons, like riot foam. Light enough to permit breathing, riot foam is supposed to set up a dense barrier between looters or rioters and police or the buildings they are protecting. Besides foam, there are other chemicals, like something called instant banana peel, which can be spread on a pavement to make footing impossible. These make up the arsenal of non-deadly weapons, which, the report says, should take the place of guns and bayonets, but which some police officials feel will leave them at the mercy of rioters. One such protest was made to the commission itself by Patrolman Carl Parcell, head of the Detroit Police Officers Association.
What did you tell the Kerner Commission about these non-lethal weapons?
I said that instant banana peel and the spray guns, that you cannot stop looters and snipers with a can of spray deodorant can or whatever you might want to call them. You cannot fight violent criminals with non-violent methods. We had a war, and I think that you have to attack the war with warlike weapons and under warlike conditions.
Another witness before the Riot Commission was psychologist Kenneth Clark. In the demand for law and order, he told correspondent Mike Wallace, he sees a different danger.
Let me make it perfectly clear, Mr. Wallace, I'm not against law and order. In fact, I'm very much for law and order. I think what the society is preparing us for is the maintenance of law and order at the same time that we maintain the inequities, the injustices, and the cruelties of the ghetto. You see, it is saying, yes, we're going to have law and order in spite of the fundamental lawlessness, which we're not really going to do anything about. Given this approach on the part of society, obviously it will have to step out its military and police control of the ghetto. It is my personal judgment that the society will not really get away with this, that it will not be able to maintain the injustices and cruelties of the ghetto merely by increasing the efficiency of its police and the militia. I think the attempt to do this will further incite more systematic rebellions in the ghetto. And I repeat that what we will really be inviting will be Vietnams in our large cities, you see.
The fears expressed by Dr. Clark are widely shared in the Negro community. They are based on the memory of white violence in the historic race riots during both world wars, a memory freshened by the events of last summer. The fears on the white side are just as strong. The great risk is that fear will make both sides trigger-happy, turning loose a kind of martyr impulse on one hand, a vigilante spirit on the other. The Commission addresses what amounts to a warning to both sides. Preserving civil peace, it says, is the first responsibility of government. Unless the rule of law prevails, it warns, there won't be any chance for order or reform. There is already a kind of a domestic arms race in the making, which the Commission would cut off by a federal law restricting the sale of guns, an idea that has been stuck for a long time in congressional debate. Beyond this, The report directs a number of proposals to the local police as the first line of defense against disorder and one of the most serious areas of friction where white and black communities confront each other every day in an atmosphere of prejudice and distrust. As an example of reform in progress, the report cites the police force of the city of Atlanta. Nelson Benton reports on what's going on there.
Henrich, wagon 20. Pooh, wagon 21.
An integrated police force is a must, says the commission, a visible symbol for the ghetto that police are not just the agents of repression put there by the white majority. 14% of Atlanta's police department is Negro, against only 5% in the cities the commission studied for its report. And it recommended that there ought to be more Negroes in the command jobs of sergeant, lieutenant, and captain. The commission was critical of many police departments for using ghetto assignments as punishment tours for bad policemen. It should be the other way, they said. The best officers, specially trained, should work in the worst neighborhoods. Atlanta, like most cities, polices itself largely in patrol cars, the only way, officials say, to cover the territory with the number of police and the amount of money it has. But the President's Commission was disturbed by this trend. It would like to see more police walking the beat, at least in the ghetto areas. Atlanta has gone back to the foot patrol in slum neighborhoods, at least from 6 in the evening to 2 a.m. The commission feels this helps the cops to know what's really going on, but mostly it helps to answer one of the most frequent complaints ghetto dwellers have about the police, that they're not concerned with crimes against Negroes, that when you need a cop in the ghetto, you can't find one. So, police must be on duty there not only when things are hot, but also when it's cool.
Yeah, slow Sunday night.
Even on slow Sunday nights, there is police business to perform in the ghetto. Any one arrest could be the flashpoint for another outbreak. And it is what policemen do and say when making an arrest that could keep the peace or start trouble.
So when you happen to arrest somebody, it wouldn't hurt you to address them by their name, titles. Negroes particularly resent being called uncle and aunt, boy and girl.
The speaker is the Reverend Sam Williams, telling a class of rookie policemen things the commission feels all police should know, but don't always practice. Williams is a professor of philosophy, a civic leader, and he's a man who knows how it feels to be called boy.
So I'm recommending to you that your job would be easy in these places where traditionally you've had some difficulty if you remember to use title. This is tremendously important. And then another thing, gentlemen, you ought to learn how to do, and that is exercising proper restraint when you're going about your work. Now, it's possible to be abusive in two ways. Physically abusive, hit a guy beside the head, crack him, or even hit him with your gun. That's physical abuse. But there's another kind of abuse, and this, I want to submit to you, is very important. I want you to be very careful as you go about your work and observing this one. That is, don't commit it. And this is what I would call emotional or spiritual abuse. You see, you may never hit me, but if you don't respect me as a man, this does me more harm than hitting me. I'd rather you hit me so I could, fight it out with you, man to man. But do not abuse my person by disrespecting my humanity.
The Negro ghetto is a mystery to most police, except as a source of crime. But the commission suggested that police start looking at it as a place where people live, with all the problems that poverty and alienation bring. The police, they said, must broaden their view of their role as law enforcers to include many welfare functions. Atlanta, among a few other cities, meets this need through a group of police officers assigned full-time to what it calls the Crime Prevention Bureau. One of them, Officer E.H. Lyons, spends all his time in the ghetto neighborhood, talking to school dropouts, organizing clubs and dances, finding food and clothing and shelter for people in need, working to change the ghetto image of the police from that enemy to that of friend. From time to time, Officer Lyons and his colleagues attend meetings in the neighborhood, meetings at which neighborhood grievances are aired. This time, the issue was vagrancy laws. Should the police be tougher or more permissive in enforcing them?
I do part-time work, but I'm not regular, employed regular. But the money that I make, my income won't let me go other places that I might want to go, so I just stand around the corner sometime and talk with the boys. I mean, we don't be doing nothing wrong. We talk about a lot of things, maybe range from sex to football or anything, But I don't think you should enforce this law because a lot of guys will go to jail for nothing, I think. And that's what I had to say. I felt like I was saying.
Well, now, that vagrancy law works two ways. Now, we have some people that won't do no kind of work, do nothing but rob and steal and stand around and try to take advantage of people and break into people's homes, those who are working. Now, that law don't apply to the good citizens. You could spend most of that time at home or find some of these lots, there's vacant lots around here that fellas could group up together and stand around. But out there on the main thoroughfares, out there mainly for business purposes, for people who are going about their business every day. And these laws are put out there because the public asked for them.
Well, you have some officers will come up in a vacant field and tell you to move on. But you know that yourself. Fine. What happened to us one Sunday? We wasn't on the corner. We was up in a parking lot, just sitting there talking. And the officer come up and tell us, we got to move. This committee talking about enforcing this law. Here, we're not down the police at all, not police folks at all, because the police folks, I think, they have been doing a pretty good job.
So you're part of this committee, why don't you just take a vote on it and see how many people are for it and who are not for it? See, like I said, majority. I'm just...
Yes, right. Ladies and gentlemen, a recommendation to the committee that vacant laws be enforced in order to eliminate groups from hanging around the street corners.
The police chief of Atlanta is Herbert Jenkins, the only law enforcement officer on the President's Commission. Chief Jenkins, we attended a meeting of one of the crime prevention committees in the neighborhood, and several complaints came up. On the one hand, there were complaints that police were harassing young Negro men in the neighborhood, and on the other hand, there were complaints that the neighborhood wasn't policed enough. There wasn't enough law enforcement there. How do you answer this?
Well, that's a natural complaint that police receive often. But the fact that these young Negroes had a complaint, and they were making the complaint, and they were making it to the police. The police were there, and they had a sympathetic understanding of the problem, and they were listening to the complaint. The fact that that was established shows that communication was established, and we've got a better chance of preventing a civil disorder in that particular neighborhood under those conditions than you would have if there was no communication.
Can the police department prevent civil disturbances this summer?
If a civil disturbance is going to be prevented, it must be prevented by the local government, the local people, and the local police. I think the record will show that National Guard and even the United States Army cannot prevent civil disorders. Certainly they can stop one when one gets started, but they do not have the experience nor the opportunity to prevent civil disorders. So much of the responsibility rests with local police departments, and they must be supported by their local officials and their local citizens. And if they're going to be prevented, these are the people that's going to prevent disorders.
The report of the President's Commission on Civil Disorders includes some familiar ideas for taking the heat off through local measures. Get the teenagers off the streets and into community service jobs, mostly working with the police. Provide formal procedures like civilian review boards for ghetto grievances against the police. Set up neighborhood city halls to give the ghetto people some direct access to their government. But local resources are limited. The job program, for example, depends heavily on federal anti-poverty funds, which are running low. The Commission's view of the problem is national, and it extends beyond next summer to the future of race relations in this country. And that, says the report, requires a commitment to national action, a coalition led by the federal government, largely financed by the federal government, but enlisting the resources of business and the will of individual citizens. These are the major proposals. On welfare, a new approach, a form of guaranteed annual income, based on the idea that even in good times, some people can't get jobs or can't make enough to support their families. On housing, a national open housing law, 6 million new low and middle income units, especially smaller buildings in scattered locations, instead of high-rise projects jammed into the ghettos. On jobs, 2 million new jobs in government and private business, better chances for advancement through job training subsidized by federal payments or tax credits. On schools, grants to promote integration, but until it really happens, a special compensatory aid to improve ghetto schools. These proposals go beyond anything the administration has been talking about. That goes for the president's recent housing message. The cost has been estimated at $2 billion a month, something like the cost of the war in Vietnam. To see what possible impact any such programs might make on the urban problems, we considered the problems of one city, Detroit, where last summer's havoc was at its worst, where apprehensions about next summer have been rising, where a local coalition has been formed and some small-scale programs are underway. On what's happening in Detroit, Hughes Rudd now reports.
In Detroit, where billboards say it's an insult to American industry to walk, motor cars mean money and money means power. Until recently, the power was all downtown, and it was optimistic power, white power, full of the old booster spirit. But the tone of this city is changing. Mayor Jerome Kavanaugh.
I'm not a pessimist by nature, nor am I an alarmist. But I do see institutions and attitudes and values crumpling all over this country as our cities are going up in flames. And that night that I flew through that city in a helicopter looking at what looked like Berlin in 1945 was really one of the most despairing days of my lifetime. But I now, upon reflection, think that what I was watching was merely something that was happening in other parts of the country and would happen again, unfortunately, unless this country proposes to commit its conscience and its resources to changing our course of action. And we haven't done it. We're not going to achieve justice within our society by ripping up our cities and tearing them apart. And anyone that thinks that that's the ultimate answer is absolutely wrong, because what will happen will be what's happening right now, unfortunately. Far greater polarization of attitudes on the part of both the white and the Negro, increasing arms race on the part of both blacks and whites in all of these cities.
The small arms race is a major fact of life in Detroit, a fact against which any plans or hopes for the city's future must be measured. Suburban ladies are being trained by the Dearborn Recreation Department. The sale of firearms has doubled in the last year. The tension of Negro disillusionment is in the air, and so is white anxiety, with both sides fearing an incident that will escalate, both arming for what they see as self-defense.
Have you ever had a gun in Detroit before? No. Then why do you feel you need protection now?
It's getting rough. Just getting rough.
Why I'm buying it? Because I want to be able to shoot through a car at somebody if they bomb my house. I'm going to be prepared. I got food, I got water. Right now I got about 150 rounds of shells. My whole neighborhood's that way.
I do not expect another riot, but I think we have the next thing to it. We are all living in fear of a riot. So I think that the extremists have already won their case, because every person on the edge of town and in the suburbs and in the inner city, we have 600,000 Negro people in Detroit, and those 600,000 do not want a riot. And we have 1 million white people in Detroit, and they do not want a riot. But all we hear right now is the people standing up that want the riot.
The big money in Detroit is trying to deal with the problem of the races. This is the new Detroit Committee. 37 of the city's white and black leaders, including the top brass. R.J. Miller from Ford, James Roach of General Motors, William Day of Bell Telephone, also Chrysler, Detroit Edison, and a dozen more of the top employers in the city. The Detroit Committee was set up by the governor and the mayor after last summer, after what the whites call the riots, after what the Negroes call the rebellion. Chairman of the committee is J.L. Hudson, Jr., the owner of a leading Detroit department store. And this is where the committee hopes to make its breakthrough, a breakthrough with jobs for the Negro ghetto. In the past, if you wanted a job at Ford, for instance, you had to go out to the factory and ask for it. And such is the hopelessness of the ghetto that many didn't even try. So Ford has come to them, sending job interviewers into neighborhood poverty centers. The company used to give each applicant a written examination, but many of the ghetto people flunked it, so the examination has been dropped.
See, you were last employed in November of '66, is that correct?
That's right.
Firm went out of business?
Right.
I'll tell you what, Mr. Burns, do you have an automobile?
Yes, I do.
Okay. We have some work available at our Wayne Assembly plant. It's located on Michigan Avenue in Wayne, Michigan. Now, if you can pass our physical, we will have the girls send you out there today, and possibly they'll put you to work either the end of this week or possibly next week.
Fine.
How's that sound to you?
That sounds good.
Okay. How long has it been since you had a job?
Well, I've been working off and on, but it's been about a year since I've had a steady job.
Do you think that the riots accomplished anything?
Yes, I think it did. It accomplished jobs anyway. After the riot, they opened up more new jobs and everything. A lot of people wasn't working, now they're working now.
The President's Commission report would call all of this a good start, with lots still to be done. The Commission says the government should get behind the program and push it. Subsidize private companies by giving them money or tax credits to train the hardcore unemployed and to open higher positions to them. The new Detroit Committee says its job program has resulted in the hiring of 55,000 people, nearly half of them Negroes. But it has barely made a dent in Detroit's unemployment problem. With new arrivals and school graduates, there are actually more people looking for work now than there were last summer. And to many in the Negro community, jobs are not enough of an answer. The Reverend Albert B. Clegg, Jr.
The efforts that Ford is making, the efforts that other members of the new Detroit Committee are making, represent a tokenism of a kind, but more essentially it represents the fact that they don't understand what the situation is. I think Ford, I think Hudson himself, I think some of the other members genuinely would like to do something if they knew what to do, but I don't think they understand anything about the black community. They don't have the slightest comprehension of what the problem is, and any efforts that they make in any direction are futile efforts. They're just whistling Dixie. They don't know what's happening at all.
Well, what is the problem?
Well, the basic problem, in not only in Detroit but throughout America for black communities, is the black man has changed his conception of himself. The black man now wants freedom, equality, but in a sense that the white man doesn't even understand. He wants dignity. He wants control of black communities. That's why the word black power is meaningful to black people and frightening to white people. Black power means the power to control your own destiny. That's what black people want. They want to control the community, the economics of the community, the politics of the community. They want to control this everywhere. And in Detroit, this is what black people want. We're tired of having white representation, represent us downtown in city government. We're tired of having white merchants take care of our business. We're tired of having white teachers in our schools, white principals, white administrators. We want all of this to be black, because this is a black community. We have been isolated from the white community. This is built into the very fabric of American life, the isolation of black people. We're separated because the white man has decided that he wants us separated. We're in a separate community always, not by choice, but because that's the only place we can be. The question is whether we're going to permit the separation to be used for our exploitation, or whether we're going to use the separation for our own benefit.
While no one voice speaks for the Negro, the theme you hear on all sides is self-determination, black power. One of its prime objectives is to dislodge white business from the ghetto, to keep the dollars from flowing out. And the first wedge has been driven, a black cooperative grocery store. One of the founders thinks the black man should not only control his own community, but be ready to defend it. Edward Vaughn.
Certainly, I think black people are prepared to defend themselves. You know, if white America wants to play Nazi, black people will not play Jews. I think that's basically what it is.
I don't follow that.
I say if white people want to play Nazi, if they want to do like Hitler did, then we aren't going to walk into gas chambers like the Jews did. We believe that there is afoot in America efforts to exterminate black people, efforts of genocide. And we will not allow this to happen to us. We have no designs upon their community. We're simply talking about our own community, and we will control our own community. And it is up to them whether they will allow this to happen or not. If they said no, then there's no hope. If they said yes, then there can be coexistence. If not, then that's the end.
If black power and self-determination seem to be what's happening in the Negro community, then whatever happened to integration? How would Detroit Negroes vote if they had a straight choice between integration and black power? Horace Sheffield, an official of the United Auto Workers Union.
I don't think there's any doubt but that the vote would overwhelmingly come out in favor on the side of those who believe in staying in the society they helped to build. And incidentally, there have been a number of tests. We've had elections here where some of the elements have, advocated all black slates in this town, and it's never succeeded. And some of the exponents of this theory have run for office themselves, and they've never succeeded. And I think it's evident all over the nation, you see. A survey was made not too long ago in which it came out that 90% of the Negroes in America felt that Martin Luther King was the most effective leader. They supported the NAACP. 85% of Negroes from one end of the country to the other in all classes. And it seems to me that really the evidence is there that Negroes want to belong in this, want to be a part of this society.
When most people think of integration, they think of schools, where it started, with that well-known deliberate speed. It has been more deliberate than speedy, and to some Negroes, it no longer seems the most important goal.
The Detroit public schools, in relation to whether an integrated school is better or an all-black school, aren't doing the job with any of the youngsters. The school studies have shown that they aren't teaching either white or black. I believe it's necessary for black youngsters to have some identification of themselves, some knowledge of their history in order for them to learn. And part of it is that they give black youngsters pictures of Dick and Jane playing in a suburban street, which means nothing to them. You have to talk about your own street. They have to be able to see themselves in a good light if they're going to be interested enough to try to learn.
Without waiting for integration, Detroit is trying to improve the ghetto schools, trying what the President's Commission calls compensatory education in one junior high school district. To support it, the state and federal governments have invested over $1 million in 2 years. $1 million to pay for smaller classes, operating 6 days a week, with more challenging courses and heavy emphasis on teaching children to read. Perhaps most important for these children is the feeling that in this classroom they are not second-class citizens. The principal of the junior high school is Martin Kalish.
I think that we have demonstrated, even though the program is only in effect 2 years, that compensatory education is a success. A success, but in a limited sense. And I want to say this very honestly because I think it needs to be said. That compensatory education is important, but the social conditions under which these children live is also important. And until the society decides that it has to do two things, provide compensatory education, but also provide for a better way of living for our children, better housing, better economics, better medical facilities, we are not going to totally solve the problem.
On some ghetto problems identified in the President's report, Detroit has made no progress. Complaints about the police are heard as often as before, and urban renewal has scarred the ghetto without healing it. To whites, the words urban renewal have a promising, hopeful sound, but to blacks they mean move out. In a block like this, as many as 1,000 men, women, and children have been forced out in the name of some progress yet to come, making way for expressways or for apartment buildings which most of them can't afford to live in. Low-cost public housing is a key item in the report, but none has been built in Detroit since 1954. Mayor Kavanaugh has a plan to build apartment houses for the poor on 1,500 empty corner lots, but so far the plan exists only on paper. While ghetto problems deepen, the black militants gather, and the crowds at their meetings get bigger. Many of them will not speak to whites at all. They have given up on the white man's world and are desperately determined to make a black world, totally separate, totally and proudly black. These are the extremists, a relative handful so far. They are led by men like Richard Henry, who calls himself Brother Imari. He and his followers predict all-out racial war and want the United States government to make a black nation out of 5 southern states.
Would you accept integration at any point before you accept the total separation?
Integration of what? You mean racial integration in this country?
Racial integration in this country.
If this question means, will we become a part of the beast? Do we want to be just other Americans in the terms that this white man has set for integration? Never. Never. Because our people must have something more than this debasement.
Brother Imari, you have granted that your position is a minority position. Now, how do you expect to bring a considerable number, or majority number, of integration-minded black people to your position? How do you think they're going to get there?
I will wait for them, and the white man will bring them.
Young Negroes growing up in the ghetto hear the voices of bitter men such as Brother Imari. So far, the ghetto has not rallied around such men. But life in the black sections of the city doesn't do much to refute the arguments of Imari and his followers. The culture of poverty, that's what the Riot Commission calls it. The culture of poverty starts with unemployment, or employment in the lowest status jobs. Many Negro fathers can't take that degradation and leave their families to escape their own failure. Mothers are forced to work. Left on their own, children grow up in a jungle where crime breeds on insecurity, and there seems to be no way out within the law. Crime is the law of the ghetto. The report says children growing up under such conditions are likely participants in civil disorder. Joe Strickland, a reporter on the Detroit News, has the reputation of knowing the ghetto better than anyone. He should. He was born there.
Well, Joe, what's the mood in the ghetto these days, would you say?
It varies from very angry until to the lack of interest, but mostly it's just angry. And I mean angry. Take a look around you at this neighborhood, and people are still living here, and they're still selling coal in this place right here because the people around here don't have furnaces in the basement. Now, what do you think those people could think in a town where we keep showing them on television that everyone is affluent, everything is getting better, you got good refrigerators. Some of these people still have ice boxes down here. Now that kind of poverty in America is a damn shame. They ripped all of these houses down, and now what are they going to build here? Nothing. Up the street a little further, they're going to build a bus terminal. And these people have no place to go, because if they had any place to go, they wouldn't be here.
Well, what could cool the ghetto this summer? Can you think of anything that the whites could do that would ease things immediately?
To ease things immediately, you begin to think in terms of jobs. If a guy's got some money, perhaps he's a little happier. But a job is not going to give him any dignity. And white people have failed to allow the Negro in America to think of himself as a dignified human being. And as soon as they start looking upon him as a human being and not some sort of animal that they can tuck away in some slum, when they get ready to move him, they just move him, come through with a bulldozer and rip it out. Well, so last summer, they showed him, well, okay, we can do a little urban renewal ourselves. And they burned it down. Now, when white people stop just shoving Negroes around, that will be the day when they can look forward to summer without any apprehension at all.
As long as the ghetto exists in Detroit or any other city, Negroes will be angry and impatient. Much of it is the impatience of people who have stopped begging and are trying to do something for themselves. Self-help, self-determination, black power, these simply reflect degrees of black disillusionment. They all mean the same thing. It's too late to patronize the Negro or buy him off. It's time to open up and let him in. Which is what the Commission means when it calls for something more than money or programs, a change of attitude, an exercise of national will. What's going to be the answer to this report? What answer in the form of action in Washington? Here's Roger Mudd, who covers Congress. Roger, what's the impact down there?
Harry, the report has not been accepted on Capitol Hill as gospel, as it has been in most of the editorial reaction in the public prints. The mentality of Capitol Hill is not geared to instant reaction to broad programs, broad studies. It's geared to specific legislative proposals. As yet, nothing has come from the White House but silence.
Why is that? There hasn't been a word.
Well, I think this is perhaps calculated. The President wants time for the report to soak in, and also he has some fairly precise political calculations he must make before he sends any program to the Hill. It's a political year. Conventions are coming. A couple of things ought to be remembered about the Congress before you analyze what their reaction would be. One is that the Congress is made up mainly of white, middle-class, small-town America. And two, nobody gets from Congress everything they want. So already you've got built in a compromise and a certain resistance to such a report as this, pointing the finger at these men on the Hill as the main cause of the riots.
There's been some indication that what Congress wanted to do this year was to pass repressive legislation to make sure that the police are ready for more riots. Is that the case?
Well, that's popular. But I think in the last 4 or 5 months there's been a general coalescing of power against such a policy. One thing I noticed in the past couple of days since the report got out was that the resentment and the anger which welled up in the Congress after the 1967 summer riots has largely subsided. However, if this coming summer witnesses more riots, or next summer, or the summer after, the recommendations in this report are going to have a very tough time getting through. The one thing that struck me as I talked to these members over the last 2 or 3 days was that the obstacle, the stone wall this report will hit in every committee room, every caucus room, every corridor is money. And they ask, how can the president run one war with barely enough money to do it, and can't even get a 10% tax increase? How can he now be expected to run a second war?
And they're talking about $2 billion a month in the report.
Well, that's equal to what the current expenditure is for Vietnam.
They aren't going to get it.
Not that kind of money. They could get possibly.
Well, is it another stalemate like Dr. Clark talks about, or will they get something?
Well, it's not a stalemate, and it's not at loggerheads. They'll get something. But I think the general feeling on the Hill is that the reliability and viability of the Congress is at stake. Can the Congress respond to this report? The response, I would judge, would be open housing, which costs no money, partnership with private industry to provide jobs and housing, tax credits, which takes nothing out of the federal treasury.
But very little in the nature of the kind of drastic, immediate action the report talks about.
Very little.
Thank you, Roger. In its own conclusion, the Commission seemed to anticipate that its sweeping recommendations would not be matched by a sweeping response. It cited the testimony of Kenneth Clark that there was an Alice in Wonderland quality to all the past hearings that followed all the past riots. The same analysis, the same recommendations, and the same inaction. The Commission cites this as a warning, not a forecast. It stressed what could be done, what should be done. Beyond this, it could offer only a qualified hope. Here is the warning and the hope.
If I were to make any conclusions from the evidence, what I've observed in my own lifetime and what I see in American history, I would have to conclude reluctantly that this society does not have the moral or the ethical substance to deal intelligently with problems of racial justice.
I think if we could move now to do these things, we could make America into what we want it to be. And otherwise, I think it's going to become something far different from what we want it to be. And we tried to set that out as truthfully and honestly as we know how. Well, what's really important here, and I hope this will be the principal impact of our report, is will. It's not so much money or legislation, it's will and determination on the part of the American people.
What the Commission has told us, finally, is this. The history of racism in this country has reached a dead end. The Commission says the deepening racial division in this country is not inevitable. The movement apart, it says, can be reversed. The alternative, the two races, white and black, at war. And, ultimately, the destruction of basic democratic values for all America. This is Harry Reisner. Good evening.
This has been a CBS News special report on the findings and recommendations of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. Harry Reisner reported. CBS News will present continuing coverage of the results of the President's Commission report on its regularly scheduled broadcasts. Tonight, see the CBS Sunday News with Harry Reisner. Each weekday,